Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 43, and Maggie and I are back. Maggie, you are actually in your house, right?
I love this game where it's like, where's Maggie now?
We'll be able to do like
A
Maggie's
map.
progress, right? Exactly.
Can we can we do it Middle Earth? Middle Earth meets Indiana Jones. You can just have the little red line going across
Right.
Middle Earth and map. Yeah,
Right.
I think I'm going to be pretty boring for the coming few weeks, though. I'm here in my home. I have really fast internet. I found my ring light. I have not yet found my microphone, so I hope the sound is okay. And right before we started, I had to move a basket of diapers because that's an old mattress and boxes behind me. And I'm not
Right.
turning my camera around, but trust me, it's just boxes,
Yeah,
boxes all the way down.
but that's still
We're getting there.
progress. Yeah.
We're getting there. But
Awesome.
we're excited for tonight because we're just saying like how long it's been since we've had some normalcy. And
Yeah.
I think it'll be fun to just kind of come back to the comfort food of discussing dwarves.
Absolutely. Yeah. So today we're going to go back to, well, we'll sort of start with the Lord of the Rings films, but not just the Lord of the Rings films. We want to we talked about Legolas and Gimli because we were looking at different characters and ways that sort of the ways that those characters were depicted and the sort of the way that their roles in the story were taken and changed or where they remain the same. And we wanted to talk more about dwarves because, of course, the discussion about Gimli kind of began that. And there's a really interesting sort of contrast to be done here, I think. Well, not just contrast in the sense of pointing out differences, but there's a really interesting field of study in kind of widening that discussion a little bit to not only be looking at the depiction of dwarves in Tolkien compared to the depiction of dwarves in the films, but then also to be thinking about how the depiction of dwarves changes between the Lord of the Rings films, the Hobbit films, and then the Rings of Power.
Yeah.
As well, which is to me so like the idea of looking at the evolution of dwarf depiction in the adaptations is a particularly interesting one because of how interesting it is to look at the evolution of the depiction of dwarves in Tolkien as well, and where that is. And of course, as it's a timely topic, as those who have been attending my Wednesday night classes can attest. We've just been talking about so we are currently discussing the War of the Jewels, the book which is at certain angles invisible on my screen because it's green, but we're talking about the War of the Jewels, and so we just finished last night. We just finished talking about the section on concerning dwarves and really looking at these moments when Tolkien himself was buckling down to doing some serious world building about dwarves, really answering questions like what in fact are dwarves, where did they come from, what's kind of going on with them, and one of the things that I would really emphasize about this that makes this such an interesting question, he's doing this several years after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. That is to say, he didn't have the answers to these questions.
Right. He's figuring it out later.
Absolutely. That. Even Gimli himself is still one of the primary vehicles for Tolkien's discovery about dwarves, rather than, Tolkien's poster boy or spokesperson for, the idea of dwarves that he already had in his head. He didn't know about dwarves. And they had a really interesting history. I don't want to get too lectury, especially since I've just been doing 3 hours of discussion of this in my other discussion, but a brief overview. I break it down to so Dwarf 1.0 in Tolkien's imagination. Dwarf 1.0, which you can find in the Book of Lost Tales, the oldest version of Tolkien's Legendarium. Dwarves are just bad guys. They are just like orcs. They are children of Melkor, they're in a list that includes orcs and trolls and dwarves. They're just flat out, straight up bad guys. Then he kind of takes it back a little bit. Like the first movement in the concept of dwarves, what I call Dwarf 2.0, then comes in at like the Quentin Olderin was. So we're like 1930s. Early, like the sketch of the mythology and the Quentin Olderin was, we're talking about between 1928 and 1930. I emphasize the dates here because this is very important, because The Hobbit is written in 1930, right? So Dwarf 2.0 was the idea of dwarf that he had in his head when the dwarves show up at Bilbo's door in The Hobbit, okay?
Right.
And Dwarf 2.0 is no longer a bad guy. They're no longer they're no longer enlisted in the Children of Melkor, like they were the first time. But they're sort of neutral parties. They are war profiteers. They're still scumbags, basically. I mean, like, they're war profiteers. They're merchants who sell weapons to both sides. Basically, they're making weapons for the orcs and they're making weapons for the elves, and they're counting their money all the way to the bank. Like, that's what the dwarves are about. Also, he says that although they are craftsmen, although they do make things, that's not what they mostly like. Mostly, they like buying and selling, and they don't make beautiful things. They will make useful things, but they care, again, they care more about the dollar value than they care, well, dollars, right? They care more about the value, the monetary value, than they care about the craftsmanship. That's not what activates them. Then the dwarves show up. So these are the dwarves that show up at Bilbo's door in The Hobbit. And if you approach The Hobbit thinking about these kinds of dwarves, very often we think about dwarves like when we read The Hobbit. If we read The Hobbit and we know The Lord of the Rings, right? You can't not think about Gimli when you're going back and reading the story that is literally about his dad, right? His dad is one of the main characters. And so you kind of import what we learn about the dwarves from, like, what we see in Gimli personally, what we learn about the dwarves from Gimli, and what we see in the appendix on Durin's Folk in Appendix A at the end of The Lord of the Rings. And it's easy to kind of import that stuff, and then you read The Hobbit from that perspective. And if you do, there'll be some things that won't really land with you, that you probably will kind of look, and some parts that will seem actively weird. Like, for instance, the point near the end, when they're at the Lonely Mountain, when not Smaug. So Smaug insults the dwarves and tells Bilbo to watch his back, because once that the dwarves are unlikely to keep any bargains that they've made with him, and that they're probably going to betray him, especially if there is money at stake. Like, so when Smaug starts saying things like, "Oh, did they promise you a 14th share? Hope you got that in writing." Like, do you think they're really gonna, like, when it comes down, do you think they're gonna really stay true to that? And Bilbo has a really sinking, like, horrible feeling when he's listening to Smaug there. Now, Smaug is a liar and malicious, but he's also not wrong. That's exactly what Dwarf 2.0 was like. And the narrator himself. So, but it's not just Smaug's words, which again those are malicious. Like, I mean, it's, he's probably doing him dirty, right? Except actually, no, not really. He's not really doing him dirty. The narrator himself, remember, says, dwarves are not heroes, right? Dwarves are not heroes. Some, like Thorin and company, are fairly good lots if you don't expect too much, right? What we are told by the narrator that we are getting are, these, like, again, remember the narrator saying in The Hobbit, saying things like, that dwarves are not heroes. But cunning folk with a very high sense of the value of money, right? When you read the Dwarf 2.0 stuff from the Quentin Olderin and the Quest of the Myth, and then you come back and read The Hobbit, it's like, holy cow, it's like a different book. Like, you're seeing the dwarves as Tolkien was imagining them at the time. And the effect of that is when Thorin changes at the end. Thorin's deathbed scene, hits like a ton of bricks in that context. He's really changed. And I believe that it is that moment. It is the moment, not just the deathbed scene, but Thorin's charge at the end of The Hobbit in the battle, his sacrificial charge. That's the moment when Dwarf 3.0 comes into being. Dwarves begin changing there at the end, not at the beginning, but at the end of The Hobbit. And by the time we then get to Gimli, Gimli is like the full exploration of Dwarf 3.0. But he didn't even have like explanations for, there were things that he was saying. Like, I'm pretty convinced in reading the stuff that he then wrote a couple years later, trying to work out dwarf stuff, that when he said things like, travelers have a hard, have a hard time telling female dwarves apart from male dwarves. He didn't even know what he was talking about. Like, he literally sits down to be like, what does that mean? Like, let me try to figure that out. To what extent is that, like, what does that actually mean, and to what extent is that true? So I think he hadn't even answered in his own mind the question, like, do dwarf women have beards? And then he sits down and thinks about it. He's like, no, yeah, I think they do. Like, babies too. Like, dwarves pop out with beards. Everybody, all the dwarves have beards. And then he asked the question, why? Like, why would that be? Why would dwarves alone of species, like, have, like, males and females have virtually no physiological distinction, between the two of them. Like, why would that be? And then he starts to give mythological explanations for why that would be, right? Anyway, so it's very, very late in the, like, it is literally after pretty much all of his published writings that he's actually sitting down and saying, I wonder what dwarves actually are. I wonder what the story really is there. So it's, in some ways, there is a kind of blanker slate for adaptation for dwarves than almost anything else in Tolkien's world. There's a sense in which even Ents are more clearly defined. Like the Treebeard chapter in The Two Towers gives this long, rich, like, exploration of who the Ents are, what their history is, what it's like to be them, what their priorities are. Right? Like, we learn more about Ents, where they came from, who they are, and what they're interested in than we ever do about dwarves before we get to, even though they only get, the Ents only get like the one chapter. They get other references, but most of what we know from Ents we derive from that one chapter, and yet it's more, literally. I mean, though everybody feels like they know dwarves really well. Yeah. Like, Tolkien's dwarves are really effective, nevertheless. Like, people come out and, like, people read The Lord of the Rings and are like, I love dwarves, I'm a huge dwarf fan, without even, like, processing, like, how little actual substance there is there. I mean, again, it's I'm not knocking it. It's marvelous how Tolkien succeeds in conveying this sense of dwarvishness with so comparatively little.
That's what I was going to agree with you. There's so much there that is wonderful, rich fodder for adaptation, that
yes,
he was adapting his own idea the whole time. I feel like the general populace was also changing their depictions. I mean, we had Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs during this time. We had, like, all these fairy tale resurgences.
Yeah. Well, and keep in mind, we had Snow White and the Seven Dwarves in the same month The Hobbit came out. Like, literally at the same time. Yes, the same exact time.
So the entire, like, Western world planet basically was reevaluating what dwarf meant to themselves.
Yeah, and Tolkien was kind of annoyed at the time that his, like, book was, like, finally being prepared to come out. The entire marketplace in the UK was awash in little Disney dwarf figurines, right? Which were not representative of his vision. Right. Yes.
But I do think that's what makes it so powerful, that everyone kind of had a vague understanding of what dwarf meant, and because he was so vague in his definition, it made it that much more malleable. Like, everybody could see their own version realized in his definition because it was so vague. So people latching on to the bits that they love and putting their own interpretation onto that world building were able to pull out the bits that they wanted to latch onto.
Yeah.
And then filmmaking, I want us to get into all the adaptations, but same kind of thing. Like, I feel like there was not so little in the text, but there was what there was so malleable that the dwarves that we got are so different, and that's okay. They each kind of took what they needed from it to
Yeah.
make the dwarf that they had. Some we
Yeah.
liked, some we didn't, but
Yeah.
yeah, the dwarves are just a really neat one, like a case
Yeah.
study when you're looking at adaptation, because they facilitate a lot.
Yeah, they are. One quick clarification in response to Nameless Arcanum here. He asks, this is in the context of works that were published in Tolkien's lifetime. Yes. So many of you might be thinking of the Aule and Yavanna chapter in the Silmarillion, where we learn about where dwarves came from and everything. That was written like 4 years after The Return of the King was published. That chapter in the Silmarillion is, I think, okay, the last thing written by J.R.R. Tolkien, in the latest thing written by J.R.R. Tolkien in the Quenta-Silmarillion portion of the Silmarillion. It's even, he had already written the Athrobeth, almost everything. I mean, of all the texts that Christopher is pulling together to create the published Silmarillion, that one is one of the latest documents that he's pulling in. So again, if you come to it that way, right? I mean, if you are a sort of a modern Tolkien, modern in the sense of like post Silmarillion, post 1977 Tolkien reader, which is most of us, I think, not all, but most. Then and so if basically your Tolkien fandom has always been premised on like I've been reading The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion, right? It might seem strange to you that I'm saying there's so little about dwarves, because he does sort of work out the sort of mythological explanation and show how dwarves fit. That's exactly what I was referring to at the beginning. That's the stuff that he works out at the end of the line after everything else he's written has been published. And Christopher was able to incorporate some of that material into the published Silmarillion in the end. But when you approach that, unlike much of the rest, I mean, the Silmarillion is really hard that way, because there are some of the things that you're reading when you're reading the published Silmarillion that are things that he wrote in 1930, like the story of the fall of Gondolin in the published Silmarillion was written in 1930. Whereas then some parts that you're reading, like the Aule and Yavanna chapter, was written 30 years later by Tolkien. Wow. So it's very different. But yeah, I'm really glad that you asked that, because I didn't address the published Silmarillion specifically. But yeah, it's one of the things about teaching my way through the history of Middle Earth, as I've been doing, that I like. One of the effects of going through that in so much detail is that in some ways, like, on some days I can like forget that the Silmarillion exists, because like instead of thinking about the published Silmarillion, like that book that Christopher put together, drawing from all of these I just have the raw materials in my head, right? So yeah. I'm thinking of like Tolkien's work on his legendarium over the course of his whole life, rather than just, and sometimes I'll almost even forget like which bits Christopher's pulling from where in order to make the published Silmarillion. So I'm glad we okay, so let's talk about initial film choices. And by initial, we're starting here. It's been too long since I've seen the Bakshi version for me to remember how they did Gimli. I don't remember Gimli's depiction in the Bakshi version, so we can't go back. I am not prepared to go back quite that far. Though it would be interesting, by the way. We should totally do a rewatch of the Bakshi film and do an episode on that.
I'm definitely down for that. It's been years since I've watched that, and just looking at the image, it just looks like He-Man with a beard. So I think it fits in what we probably think of the Bakshi adaptation. But in terms of character, I don't really recall either.
Yeah, no, I don't remember. Like, I'm tempted to say that like my utter lack of memory of Gimli from the film is significant, but it might not be. There might be really interesting things there that I'm simply forgetting. But I know that, like, I remember things that were done with Legolas, like, for instance, replacing Glorfindel with Legolas. The tradition of writing Glorfindel out of the script is a well-established tradition by the time it gets to all the jokes about Glorfindel being tied up in the closet and Arwen stealing his horse are old jokes. Like, I mean, that's poor Glorfindel has been locked away for he was locked away back in the 70s. But anyway, So, but yeah, anyway, so we can't go back there. But starting with the Lord of the Rings films, right? We talked about Gimli and Gimli's character and Gimli's role to some extent, right? On the one hand, I can't help but wonder, and we sort of raised this before, the choice to make Gimli the comical figure that he is, to make him, I don't want to just say the comic relief, because he's not the only source of comic relief. He is not like the one clown in a group of heroes. Goodness knows Merry and Pippin do plenty of clowning as well.
Yeah, clown isn't the word I would put on him.
No,
He has some humor, but it doesn't feel topical. It feels pretty mature.
Yeah. Anyway, so my question is, how much of their choice to make the dwarf comical in that way is an accident of history? Like, is because they cast John Rhys Davies, who is such a brilliant comic actor, and not only a brilliant comic actor, but a brilliant comic actor who is perfectly positioned to play that particular kind of comedy. He's not a comic actor, like, he's not like Will Ferrell or, somebody like that, right? I mean, he does the, like, almost straight man, but the one who can be relied upon to make funny side comments, and not to be making jokes exactly, but to be, and we talked about his genius for inviting laughter at his own expense without wholly degrading his dignity as like the dignity of his character. I mean, it's a really marvelous line that he walks there to make himself an object of fun without making you simply like despise, right? Like to to use the obvious contrast in my head from last week, the line which Jar Jar Binks so horribly fails to maintain, right? Where I mean, again, like where the people of my generation all, wanted to throttle Jar Jar Binks and would like. Could you imagine how audiences would have cheered if they'd actually killed off Jar Jar Binks in the final battle, right? Like the simple relief of that, right? Anyway, point is, I don't know anyone who had that reaction to Gimli.
And that's a good comparison, because like when you're thinking about it, like Jar Jar Binks's jokes, every single one of them I anticipated in pain, and I rolled my eyes upon delivery. It was always like, oh God, they did it. Whereas John Rhys Davies, you're always like, well, what's he going to do next? The anticipation was like, I can't wait. And when it delivered, you were laughing. Like it was comfortable. You felt safe. It was a secure space. You didn't have to feel like bad stuff was going to go down.
Yes. So again, I'm wondering to what extent, obviously it's not a question that's really answerable, but I have to wonder, since Gimli is the only dwarf presence in the entire Lord of the Rings films. I mean, we see other dwarves there at the Council of Elrond, whom we don't know who they are, and they don't do anything or ever say anything. So I'm not counting them, right? Apart from those cameo eye candy dwarves that we get in the Council of Elrond.
And they're only there to show us that dwarves exist in the world.
Yeah, like, they're just there for demographic reasons. Yeah, exactly. They're props, exactly. Anyway, so they, apart from them, I don't think there's ever a single dwarf who shows up on camera even at any point in the whole rest of the Lord of the Rings films. So John Rhys Davies, like the character played by John Rhys Davies, is dwarves in the Lord of the Rings films. If it weren't for John Rhys Davies, like if they didn't have a brilliant comic actor playing Gimli, would they have made the same choice? Did they Do we know? Did they? I mean, you might remember from the commentaries better than I. Did they say that that this was their plan? Like they wanted John Rhys Davies for the part because they planned to make Gimli comic relief, or is that something that kind of developed because they had John Rhys Davies? You know what I mean?
I don't remember specifically, but I vaguely do remember it being like we wanted him.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so I don't know what came first, the humor or the actor.
Yeah.
So I don't know if they said we want a brilliantly comedic actor, but I do vaguely remember them saying this is who they wanted for the role.
They really
but I
wanted
also
him.
vaguely remember them talking about 2 or 3 other contenders, and now I don't remember who those were. But
okay.
yeah, he was definitely, front runner.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the one hand, it makes a certain, if you think about thinking back to the question of like Gimli's role in the Fellowship, right? Gimli and Legolas are the two they're the two most other members of the Fellowship. I mean, hobbits are other too from our perspective, but there's 4 of them, right? Like demographic, like
and we saw their life a lot at the beginning. We know where they came from. We saw other hobbits.
We
saw
start off in their scale. Yeah.
That is our home base. We know what that is. Right. And it's very similar to human home base, so that's relatable.
Yeah, similar, but just different in scale. And of course, like this, I mean, was one of the things that the films accomplish kind of brilliantly is orienting us into the film world in the Shire, such that when we start seeing normal-sized humans, they look like monsters, right? Yeah. Like in the Bree scenes, of course, in particular, I'm thinking of here. And even Gandalf hitting his head in the rafters of Bag End, serves that end. But anyway, yeah. So, so you've got like the Hobbit contingents, which are kind of normalized, especially through our filmic experience in the first part of the film. And then you've got the humans, and Gandalf is, I mean, he's kind of other. He's a special case, right? And he's at home everywhere, right? He's at home in the Shire at the beginning. He's at home with the humans, and he looks like a human. Like there's not much that's different about him, right? But Legolas and Gimli are the two that don't fit into either. So our 2 major demographics that we're sort of comfortable. We're comfortable with humans by default because like most of us are humans, and so like we connect with that. And we've been led to connect to the hobbits, and they are numerous in the Fellowship. So in the middle we have Legolas and Gimli. Legolas, elves are other in certain ways, right? But Gimli is more different than in that, like size-wise, he's unique. Like he's the one who's in between. He's neither nor, right? I mean, I love the fact that this is one of the things that I remember, that John Rhys Davies is so much taller than the 4 guys who played the hobbits. They didn't have to scale separately for him, right? Yeah. They just used the hobbit scale and made him big by hobbit scale.
And made that work.
Yeah. Which I think is cool. I think that's really fun. But
and just what you were saying about like other and screen time and familiarity, like we see a lot of elves. We see a lot of elf home. We go to Galadriel's home, we go to Elrond's home. Like we see the space that they exist in. The only space we see of dwarves is dead and moldering and decaying. So like we don't have any living, thriving example of dwarf culture except Gimli. Yes. So he does have a big old weight to carry on his shoulders.
Yeah, he does. And that makes it particularly interesting that he becomes the comic relief, that he becomes the figure of fun. That seems to be a kind of way to handle his otherness in some ways. Like his one way or another, he was going to be an oddball, right, in the company. Like even just visually, even just physically, he's an oddball in the company. He's the one like tweener in size. And they chose to make him comic. Again, done very well and done without denigration, I think, of his character. I mean, there are many. Gimli is, and in my experience talking to Tolkien fans, Gimli is rarely in people's top 3 things I was most annoyed by, like for Tolkien purists, Gimli is rarely the top of the list, but often Gimli is somewhere on the list, right near the bottom of like, man, like Gimli is so great, and he gets made into like we're just prompted to laugh at him all the time in the films. Again, I don't think he doesn't get into Faramir territory because, like, despite the fact that we are invited to laugh at him lots of times, John Rhys Davies can pull it off, that he can be acting like a clown in one moment, inviting us to laugh at him, and yet deliver a heroic line in the next, in the next scene. So like that's, and that happens, right? We get that from Gimli at several points in the film. There are even those moments which are like both at once, which both like partake of the kind of like comic feel of Gimli's character, while also being heroic. Like I'm thinking here of Gimli in the Chamber of Mizarble, saying like, talking about the orcs and saying like, they will find that there is one dwarf here that still draws breath, right? Like on the one hand, that's very similar to Gimli's spirit of like fun, but it's not fun. Like we're not laughing at him when he says that, and yet it's demonstrably the same sort of spirit that he's speaking with as when he, is being, gruff and funny and inviting us to laugh at him. So I mean, I do think they walk the line really, really interestingly, like really well there.
And I do wonder how much, like you said, that John Rhys Davies brought into that, because we do know that rewrites happened throughout the entire production. Like there were loads of opportunities that they stuck extra things in, or redid things. And we also know at certain points they just left the cameras rolling, and John Rhys Davies would come up with 17 different options for what to do with that, So it could just be whatever tickled them that moment, or maybe the group laughed the hardest and it came out as trite to us, but it came out as perfect and on point in those 17 options. Like, there's so many factors that can weigh into like how that would fall. But it's so interesting for us looking at it from this side, being like, but this is what's defining dwarf. So that what could have been a very quick, easy decision on set because it made people laugh now has such implications to the whole like understanding of that culture. Yeah. Boom.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the reasons I was bringing up the oddball thing is that it seems to me very significant, therefore, that when Peter Jackson's team rolls around to the Hobbit films, now suddenly we are in a totally different space. Right now, dwarves are the norm. Now we're looking at a party of 15 people, 13 of whom are dwarves, right? So now we're living in a dwarvish world. The dwarves are no longer, they're now the opposite of the oddballs, right? Anyone who's not a dwarf is an oddball now, visually and culturally in the context of The Hobbit. And so one of the really remarkable challenges they have is like, how do they maintain consistency with what they established? What we saw, not just of Gimli personally, but what we were instructed to believe he represented about dwarf culture, right? But now how do they do that? How do they translate that into the context of a story which is now dwarf frame of reference from beginning to end, basically, and in which the Hobbit is supposed to look out of place and be out of place for most of the story. And indeed, like, if anything, I thought that thinking about Martin Freeman's depiction and about the way they did Bilbo, I don't think they went too far at any point in making Bilbo out of place. If anything, he was acclimated almost too fast, I think. I would have preferred even to see him even more like, there weren't that many moments in the films which felt to me like those moments in the book. So those repeated moments in the book when he's imagining himself back by his hearth with the kettle just beginning to sing, not for the last time, right? I could have done with even more Bilbo being uncomfortable and not, in his comfort zone on the adventure, right? Even than we got. Anyway, again, the point is simply that they didn't even play the oddball the oddball card with Bilbo, you know, to the to the max there. But the dwarves are now definitely the norm. So what is your feeling about how they thinking, especially now? Trying not to think about where it went in the end, but I think almost everybody agrees that I've talked to that of the Hobbit films, the first was the best, and the beginning was the best of all. Like, it was, you know, half an hour into the first Hobbit film, most people had fairly high expectations, I think, for, you know, where the whole thing was going to go.
Yeah.
In particular, like the high watermark, I think, of those whole films is the Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold song that the dwarves sing in Bilbo's house. That was it was remarkable and really well done. But in any case, so like, what are your thoughts about how, like, from a sort of from an adaptation standpoint, knowing where the Peter Jackson team was coming from, you know, what they did to sort of establish dwarves as the new normal in, you know.
And a really interesting thought too, that it's pretty much the same team doing this. So rarely do we have that kind of opportunity to look at something like this too. So we're not doing backsheet to this. This is the same team from A to B. So it's a really neat one to look at, of how they kind of pivoted to give this different depiction. But the thing that I love about that whole tone was the pacing. They just seem to get everybody's voice, everybody's character, everybody's kind of like history, and even insecurities in some of those moments. Like, you just saw a really beautiful character depiction in the first like half hour of all of them. And having it culminate in this really beautiful thing that their culture values. They all know the same song. This is what they find important. That all was covered in such a great way in a pretty short amount of screen time that, the expectation was real high. We were on board. I will follow this culture. I am on, like, it's great. I feel like it was set up really strongly, and I didn't think it varied that too. It didn't feel alien to me compared to Gimli. It felt like it could exist in the same world, and Gimli was the next generation on, so this leading into Gimli makes sense because, I mean, you can start taking it into this, like, Gimli's one individual in this entire culture of people, most of people. I could see if there are differences, it might just be down to Gimli being different, you know, and here we are looking at this big group of dwarves, and they all make sense too. So we're seeing a lot of individuals that any kind of differentiation between Gimli and that group makes sense because they're different people. But it was so nice to have that moment of seeing that culture. And I do think that set up the Hobbit films really well. They just didn't deliver the way we wanted them to.
And Thorin is really the heart of that, right? You know, Thorin becomes the one. Does Richard Armitage ever make us laugh on purpose in the Hobbit films? I don't think he does. I mean, he's very serious. Like, the character of Thorin and Richard Armitage's playing of Thorin is serious and grim.
It's pretty heavy.
Yeah, pretty heavy. Now, it's easy enough to do that. Like, Thorin can play the heavy, serious, sort of epic drama, emotional, you know, freight side of the equation, because you've got plenty of other dwarves to be comical, as they were. And there were several of the dwarves who were sort of... the
Merry and Pippins.
Yeah, nothing but comical, basically. I mean, like, whose contribution was comical. I will add, by the way, what you were also suggesting there. One of the things that was on my shortest list of things that I thought were one of the biggest challenges for adaptation of The Hobbit to film was the sheer quantity of dwarves. 13 is a ridiculous number of characters. I mean, not to mention 15. But in a sense, Bilbo and Gandalf were almost free, right? Because we knew Gandalf already very well. And Bilbo was, you know, also kind of known and also sort of Frodo adjacent. So, you know, we were well schooled for Bilbo, and so that wasn't hard. But 13 separate dwarves It's
And usually the first response I get to that is, yeah, but there were 9 in the fellowship. Well, yeah, but the 9 were super strong individuals,
right,
like
and
very
very
separate.
different. Yeah,
And they went off on different adventures to different places and small groups. This is one cohort of
yeah,
13 tends
yeah,
to stick together for the majority.
yeah, exactly, the
And
whole
to be
way.
perfectly honest, I still struggle telling them apart. So like while I do think they did a good job of showing us that, especially in that first half hour, constantly through the rest of the film, I was like, which one is that? Which one is that? Oh,
Right,
is he
yeah,
the
is that
one that,
Ori, or yeah, yeah, no,
it's
exactly.
still Trixie. Yeah.
Exactly. And the thing is, exactly as Edith was just saying, Tolkien doesn't try to differentiate
No.
the dwarves. I mean, Tolkien, and this is actually something that's very perceptible when you look at the manuscript development. As Tolkien, from his first draft of The Hobbit to his final version of The Hobbit, there's a consistent trend in the direction of limiting the number of dwarves who speak. He was constantly like in the first draft. His first impulse was to be like, "I need a dwarf to say something. Who hasn't talked? Nori. Let's make Nori say this, right?" Because he seemed to be trying to kind of spread it out and give give everybody a job, right? But as he revised, he wisely, I think, reallocated those speeches to a small number of dwarves, so that in the end we have Thorin, who is important, who matters. We have Balin, who is the lookout guy and the senior guy, who is Thorin's second in command, basically, and who also is particularly friendly to Bilbo. Right, you have Bumber, who is the comic relief. You have Dory, who is still a pretty minor character, but he's sort of the like mainstream kind of like rank and file dwarf sort of doofus, basically. I mean, like he doesn't have he's nothing special about him. He seems to me to kind of represent the like Bilbo's relationship. He's like the spokesperson for Bilbo's relationship with like again, the sort of rank and file dwarves. He's like the default background dwarf, basically. But he's the one who keeps, like, when Bilbo just needs to interact with somebody. Like it's Dory who's carrying him when he tumbles down and ends up meeting Gollum, right? It's Dory whose legs he's clinging to when he's flying away with the eagles, right?
And Madagog here, Dory was a bit of a mother hen. Yeah.
Right, to some extent. Right, yeah. But anyway, yeah. So so they Bilbo isn't lucky number 13. He is lucky number 14. Like, he is the number to keep it from being 13 is an unlucky number. It's bad luck to set out with 13 people in the party, and Bilbo is the lucky number so as to prevent the party from being only 13. That's why he's getting by his contract a 1/14 share of the treasure. Anyway, so Tolkien. But this is a classic. This is why it was on my short list of things that I thought was going to be so challenging, because it's a classic example of things you can do in a book that you can't really do in a film, right? If you're going to have a central group of protagonists who are traveling together and whom the audience is, traveling with, and who are involved on screen in all of the adventures, and as you say, don't split up, they're just in a pack the whole time. In a book, you can just have a bunch of nameless dwarves, not nameless, but a bunch of faceless dwarves who never say anything and who are kind of filler. I mean, like,
they just move the thing along.
Yeah. I mean, you can just say like all 13 dwarves were there, but in the film, when you're actually looking at 14 or 15 people, counting Gandalf, standing there, right? And you've got some who never say anything, who just are like, I mean, if there were just some who are introduced to once, right, but who never say anything and never make any clear contribution to the action and have nothing distinctive about them at all, then and they're just kind of like going around in a herd, it would be weird. It would be very strange
and boring. Like, you need something in a film to move the story along, so it has to work in a story framework, but also to like emotionally attach to, and there's nothing in that to attach to. So Madigo pointed out, they did a good job differentiating them visually. They did, the different beards, the different lengths, the different colors, even a little bit of height. Like there was definitely stuff that marked them separately. But
Yes.
when I started thinking about them, I couldn't help but compare them to the Lost Boys in Peter Pan.
Yep.
Like those are all young boy orphans. You could say that is one
Unit. Yeah.
one unit that is
Yeah.
not differentiated either. But when you start pulling them out into these individual characters, then there's a real personality with each of them because that's what they made happen. So I feel like the film was pretty good at pulling out some of those individual characteristics. But when you're doing that, it does kind of cheapen, might be the word I'm going for. It kind of cheapens the character because you're giving them a caricature as opposed to like depth.
Because there's no time for depth times 13.
No, there's just topical, and you're like, oh, that's the funny one, that's the silly one, that's the smart one, that's the
one with the axe sticking out of his head. That's the one that fights with daggers instead of axes. Yeah.
I mean, they basically created Sleepy Happy Dumpy, Sleepy Happy Grumpy, Dopey.
Dopey. I think Dumpy would have been a good dwarf.
That could work. Maybe that was the 13th one.
Who knows? Sorry, I'm going to be laughing about that for a while. Bomber is Dumpy Dwarf. That's clearly true, Phil. I absolutely agree. And actually, you were right to bring that. Like, that's how Disney distinguished them.
Yeah.
Right. Disney distinguished them not only by giving them names, but like giving each of them, like their name was their one identity. Caricatured thing. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Their one identity. And that makes it easier to not only keep them straight, but and also to provide visual cues, right? Like it's, you can always tell.
And to write jokes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's pretty easy to see how things are going to go when Dumpy comes into the scene, Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yes. Anyway, so of course, like again, when I remember way back in the Riddles in the Dark days when we were speculating about this, one of the questions we were talking about, I think pretty early on, was, are they going to cut dwarves? Because on the one hand, that would seem like that's an obvious solution to this problem. Like 13 is too many dwarves. Let's send him off on the road with like 5 dwarves or 6 dwarves. But of course, it's hard. Like I think they were rightly thinking that people would be up in arms if Bilbo went on the road with only 5 dwarves instead of 13 dwarves, and then you'd lose the lucky number element, right? So it was a difficult choice for them to make. I think of any issue I have with the Hobbit films, I don't have any problems with that. But again, in the context of, in some ways, this seems to me like one of the really interesting framing elements that, I won't say determines, that's too strong a word, but had a significant impact on the choices they made in their depictions, right? Just as in The Lord of the Rings, the fact that not only do they only have Gimli, but that Gimli is the oddball, the biggest oddball in the Fellowship, and is alone in the sense of being the only dwarf through the entire show. And as you pointed out, not only the only dwarf, but the only living representative of dwarfness, unlike Legolas, with whom we get lots of elves. Even when we meet him from the very beginning, when we meet Legolas, I talked about him feeling like more of an insider because of how he and Aragorn are already buds, right? But even if you think about it at the Council of Elrond, right, in the debate in the Council of Elrond in the film, Legolas is kind of speaking on behalf of elves there, in an elf place.
In an elf place, exactly. Like being led by an elf higher level person, being escorted by lots of other higher level elves. Like he's definitely not on his own.
Exactly.
And so you get the feeling that he is some sort of a prince. You get that kind of royal vibe where we have nothing to give us that impression of Gimli, which he is, but like
he is, but sort of.
But we don't have that kind of gravitas coming along with his character.
Exactly. So that fact right? That like just it's just one of the parameters that they were working with in doing Gimli's character, that he is solitary and an oddball, and the most kind of out of step with everybody else. Again, even visually, was the parameter that they had to integrate creatively. We have to integrate 13 bloody dwarves into this story is the parameter that they were dealing with in the Hobbit films. And I think that parameter is clearly as influential. One of the reasons, it seems to me almost inescapable, even if Gimli had not been comical, right? Even if John Rhys Davies had said no, right? And they'd ended up, casting, I don't know whom, right? John Malkovich or somebody, as Gimli. Isn't that a fun thought exercise?
I really want to see that Saturday Night Live sketch.
Yeah. But anyway, even if they'd gone in that direction, right, with Gimli's character. So I was trying to think of a really good actor who is not comic. So anyway, then on the other side, right, you have I think they would still have had to do a lot of the jokes and gags that they did. Or rather, let me say, it would still have made sense to do the jokes and gags that they did in the Hobbit films, because they were forced to present, as you were saying, like the parameters almost compel multiple caricatures, right? In order to, because we don't have time for deep character development for everybody. They even did deep character development for more of the, like the character development we got with, it was Beaufort. Bifur was the one with the axe in the head, and his brother Beaufort was the one who got more lines and had like soulful conversations with Bilbo, as I recall.
I'm like looking them up, like, hang on, I've got my chart.
Yeah, the one with the winged hat, Edith. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's again, see, Edith, that's exactly it. Like the one who wears that hat. Like you've got to give him a different hat, so that yes, that's what we need. Yeah. The one played by Jimmy Nesbitt. I think that's right. Yeah. So like he's an example of one of the dwarves, and Beaufort is in the Hobbit, in the book. Beaufort is absolutely one of the faceless crowd. Like he is one of the filler hobbits, who barely ever even comes up except in a list. And dwarves. I said hobbits. Dwarves. Yes, dwarves in the Hobbit.
We all know.
They actually gave him some depth of character and background and connection with Bilbo, which like far transcends anything that Beaufort got in the book. So again, I mean, when we talk this way, I want to emphasize that I'm not insulting the Hobbit movies, but I will insult the Hobbit movies in other ways. But I'm not insulting the Hobbit movies when I say this, not in this way. Like it does seem to me an almost inescapable outcome of simply having that many characters. And if you're going to do a caricature, it's going to be funny. Like a comedy is going to happen whether you mean it or not. So you might as well mean it. Seems to me to be like, how could you do like solemn caricature that doesn't come off as funny? I mean, you'd at least be running the risk of having people laugh at something you didn't mean them to laugh at. You might as well, kind of just dive into that direction. But anyway.
And I think there's a certain element of the dwarves that do lend themselves to comedy, like they just seem to be that jovial beer drinking, kind of crew. Sure.
And that's of course the other element is that the Hobbit is funny. And this I know was one of the things that they attempted to take the comedic value of the Hobbit seriously in the film. They wanted the films to be light and comedic in a way that is similar to the way that the book was light and comedic. That's a bigger topic, and I think one of the more significant. I think that's it's one of the significant sort of root failures of the Hobbit films, in my opinion. That attempt
tried to be light,
that it tried to be light, that the way it was trying to be light and dark at the same time, the way in which it was trying to. It's an understandable and even in its way an admirable thing for them to say The Hobbit is light and comical. We want this to be light and comical as well. But simultaneously, they were also saying The Lord of the Rings is a great epic story. The Hobbit is the prequel that sets up that great dark epic story. We want to tell we want to show how it was the great dark epic prequel of the great dark epic Lord of the Rings story. But also we want to make it light and comical. Like I did not think that worked. The two of them together. Yeah.
Dissonance is probably one of the words I would use, because again, we keep taking it back to music, but like tone is really the issue there. And when you can absolutely have different notes of tone throughout that. So like there's comedic moments in Lord of the Rings as well as, the big heavies, but the tone is pretty constant throughout. We know there's little peaks and troughs of moments, but the tone is pretty solid. Like this is an epic, serious story of real life people and real emotions and dramas and trials and whatnot. Hobbit, I don't think we really have that. Like the tone is just kind of like, I don't know, let's just wander and see what happens. And so it just doesn't feel the same.
Yeah. Even in moments in The Lord of the Rings that I find objectionable, like I cited the dwarves are natural sprinters scenes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where I think that the comedy, the way in which we're being asked to laugh at Gimli, that's one of the places where it feels to me most grating, where it fits least well with the sort of the dramatic action that's happening at that moment. Again, even there, I'm not saying it's utterly horrible. That's one of the places where it grates on me most. But even when I take what I think is one of the least successful moments of dwarf comedy in The Lord of the Rings and compare it to The Hobbit, it's still night and day as far as how much more successful it was. Even at its lowest points, the Lord of the Rings film never becomes silly.
Right.
The Hobbit films are silly many times. I mean, think of the naked pyramid in the statue in Rivendell. I mean, seriously, that is, and I don't, it goes in it's not just like we're going to do it, but more because, it goes way over a line, I think.
And just to comment on Phil's other part of his statement, how much is the distance because the handover from Guillermo del Toro to Peter Jackson? I mean, we won't know because we weren't in the room, but I mean, it was Guillermo del Toro who started this, and then Peter Jackson took over. So he didn't have the same prep time and involvement in early drafts of script to put his own stamp on it. It's kind of more like he didn't want the ship to sink, so he picked up the helm at the last minute, right? Like that's definitely the vibe I've gotten from the whole development side of it. But he was still the director. Like he absolutely still could change the tone and change the lines and change the, like, you still have that ability. So maybe he didn't have the same attention and passion that he brought to Lord of the Rings, because that was a passion project of his, and that was a huge, moment for him to take that up and realize that vision. And then you're kind of tapped out, right? Like I the only big thing I can compare to in my life is finishing my PhD. And if somebody had offered me another PhD 12 months after I'd finished my first PhD, I would have laughed in their face and run the other direction.
Right.
So,
well, it's funny because sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
That was right. I imagine picking that up was not a fresh brain. That was a brain that lived in this world and could get it done. It was somebody that was well practiced and could get it done and do a decent job. And I think he did that, but it wasn't the same inspiration that we saw in the first round.
Exactly. And to me, the really interesting parallel is that another person who felt similar to that was Tolkien when asked to write a sequel to The Hobbit. And he was like, I got nothing. I had a bunch of fun ideas, but I put all I didn't save any fun ideas. Like I put them all in the Hobbit book. Like that was, I was kind of throwing everything together there. I didn't hold anything back. Like I don't have anything more. Now, of course, like the irony there is that Tolkien then goes on to write, you know, the greatest book of the 20th century. But notice how that happened, right? It did not happen because he was like, I'm going to try to just like recreate the magic of what I did before. Instead, what he did was he allowed it to grow into something totally different, right?
He moved it along.
He began, right? He forced himself, and it did seem forcing. He was wanting to work on the Silmarillion instead. He was working on the Silmarillion instead, and then was only forced to abandon it and go back. I mean, I don't want to over dramatize. I'm not saying like he went back to it with loathing, but he went back to it with little plan and with much less enthusiasm than he had been working on the Silmarillion stuff. Less enthusiasm by all indicators. To sit down and give a fair shake at making a sequel to The Hobbit. And the transformative thing that occurred was the moment when he discovered a new story. That was something quite, and stopped trying to force it to be, you know, what it wasn't gonna end up being. And I mean, it still was. You can see him still assuming for a long time afterwards that this was still kind of going to be like a Hobbit story, but it was already it had already begun to change and changes pretty significantly not too long into it. But that's the difference, right? In the end, it seems that that's sort of the step that seems not to have happened with Peter Jackson and team. And again, I don't want to like cast stones, especially under the I mean, the realities of, you know, production time and deadlines and things like that. Those are real constraints, right? And he didn't have 17 years,
right.
which is what Tolkien wrote it in only about 14 years. But still, like, he didn't have that. That was a luxury Jackson did not have.
And like, I know we're kind of drifting off of the dwarf focus, but like, I also just can't help but think of the difference of process, because we're taking one fairly short book and turning it into 3 quite long films.
Yes.
Versus 3 very long books into 3 what I would call short films, even though they're very long in comparison to what the ground they had to cover.
Absolutely.
That was a very different adaptation process. And yes, they added lots of stuff into the Hobbits to kind of stretch and eke that out, but they were starting with a very different source material than what they had for Lord of the Rings. So that's a really different procedure to adapt that.
It is. And this is something that I think I've often historically been frustrated when people talk about that. Like when people say Hobbit films are bad because they took this little, you know, book and stretched it into 3 big films. No, like there is more. They would have to have cut content from The Hobbit. You know, like, yes, it's a small book, but the proportion of book to film, like, again, people, I feel like people often misunderstand this. Like the very idea that a feature film, 2 to 3 hours, is the logical adaptation size, like that corresponds in some way to a novel, is ridiculous. Like you have to attack a novel with an axe to tell a 2-hour version of that story.
I'm sure I've said this before, but there is, I forget his name. There's a French filmmaker that tried to do a word-for-word adaptation of a novel, and it ended up being like 19 hours or something.
It is. Yeah. The unabridged audiobook of The Hobbit is 11 hours long. Like, it's a long story. And
that's just reading it, not showing it.
Not showing it. There would be things you'd have to add in order to do it. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I always feel that now again, I'm not saying that it's incorrect that the process. Because what you said is exactly the thing that I think is exactly correct, but which I think people don't talk about. It's not that you're forced to like stretch and strain the story to make it 3 films. You could easily make The Hobbit into 3 films, especially when you're doing what they were doing, which is connecting it explicitly to the Lord of the Rings story, as Tolkien didn't do in The Hobbit for the very good reason that it didn't exist when he wrote The Hobbit, right? So there is plenty of, when you take the Hobbit text plus all of the extra backstory that Tolkien developed after writing The Hobbit, right, in the context of the Lord of the Rings, the way the White Council and the confrontation with Sauron gets developed, for instance, and you know, the way that one brief reference to Gandalf going to the dungeons of the Necromancer in Dol Guldur in chapter 1 of The Hobbit then becomes this big whole thing, right? With the discovery of Sauron and everything, but that's not what it is, right, in The Hobbit itself. Anyway, so when you take not only The Hobbit plus that extra, to use the word that I dislike, canonical stuff, right? Not even stuff that they're making up. I'm not talking about the tombs of the Nazgul or any of that stuff, right? Or sandworms. I'm talking about the actual material. There's plenty of material for 3 films. Like, that is not where the problem lies. The problem is, exactly as you say, the process of adaptation was quite different. And to try to, again, it feels like the pressure to have a result, which is this, like, you're going to do 2 different processes and produce, in the end, 2 like comparable things. Like, he was supposed to somehow produce the Lord of the Rings films again, even though by a wholly different process, and you know, therefore, like, the relationship is completely different. It's that's a huge ask. That is a lot. That is a creative challenge that I think is way harder than a lot of people think. I mean, I hear people dismiss this, like, oh, it's because they got greedy and tried to squeeze it into 3 films. Not saying greed wasn't involved, not saying that choice wasn't a bad choice, tactically speaking, to make this switch when they did after they were already in production and whatever else. Like, sure, there are lots of ways in which I'm sure that, you know, put some very serious impediments and obstacles in the making of that film, or the making of good films under those circumstances. But it's not as simplistic. Like, you can't just wave your hands and say, like, see, like, they were lazy and incompetent the second time. It's legitimately interesting and different what they did. Okay, so coming back to Dwarves, we're obviously not going to get to the Rings of Power, but that's okay. I was
like, that's okay. I kind of want to spend like a good chunk of time on that, so we'll do that next week. But
because of course, as you were saying, it is a unique privilege to compare The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings films, because it's the same team, to then take the next step and say, looking at all of the stuff that team did and then compare it to what this totally different team is doing, is really a separate question.
And totally different team. I mean, I definitely, but filmed in New Zealand using Weta, like, they want it to have the same kind of, you know, same John Howe, they want to have that same kind of vibe as what Jackson created over the course of 6 films. Like, Jackson has defined what the world thinks of when they picture Middle Earth. And also, like, I know people are already saying, like, wait, but what about John Howe and Alan? Like, yes, because he used them as their concept artists. So, like, all of the visuals have been consistent. Bakshi not so much, but everybody else, like, all of them have been really consistent. So they want it to live in this world. So for Jackson to have 6 years to develop this, he kind of did define dwarves as much as Tolkien did. In some respects. So it is
absolutely
Jackson in this bit.
Absolutely. And this is sorry, I'm laughing at myself. This is
I'm laughing at Phil. Gosh, don't tell me we got sidetracked. What?
Yeah, exactly.
I never do that.
No, I'm laughing at myself because this is exactly what you just said is exactly what I was talking about in the famous video where I was edited in such a way as to piss everybody off back in the fall of last year. What I was talking about dwarves and dwarf beards in that interview, which by the way was a 2.5-hour discussion I had with the interviewer. And during one long passage of that long discussion, I was talking is exactly that phenomenon. The fact that people watch the Lord of the Rings films and they think they know what dwarves are. And they genuinely believe, like, they are not just like, they genuinely believe that it is Tolkien's dwarves that they have in their heads, right? When in fact, what it is Jackson's dwarves that they have. And I'm not saying that like, and that's a totally different thing. Like, no, I'm not saying that it's inappropriate or whatever, it doesn't fit. But the whole point of the discussion that I was having is that there are lots of things that people think they know about Tolkien and dwarves and how he depicted dwarves and what he said about dwarves in The Lord of the Rings, which are not true in that framework. Like, we are not in fact told those things. But they get strongly emphasized in the films, and so it's complicated. But yes, that leap. I think you are absolutely correct that Peter Jackson defined dwarves and what dwarves are as much as Tolkien did. I do agree that Tolkien did more in the Silmarillion, but for people, except for the people who have read the Silmarillion, I think that's true.
And like what we were saying about Tolkien, like his definition was defined and redefined so many times over the course of 30, 40 years. Jackson had 6 movies to do it in, so he had to kind of bring some cohesion to it. Yes. So he, I think, gave us a very clear single image of dwarves, but it's a very nuanced image because we have 14 dwarves to really explore that and a couple different dwarf worlds.
Yeah, exactly. And and cohesion, you are absolutely correct. Tolkien's, and again, try telling some people online that Tolkien's vision for dwarves is incoherent, and they'll tell you that Tolkien is rolling in his grave now because of what you just said.
How dare you?
But Tolkien would be the very first person to say he wanted to rewrite The Hobbit throughout his later life. The Hobbit annoyed him more and more every year after he wrote The Lord of the Rings, because there are several ways in which The Hobbit is not consistent or coherent because of the organic way in which The Lord of the Rings grew out of it. And that is one of the things, like the dwarves that are depicted through almost all of The Hobbit is Dwarf 2.0. Like, his idea of dwarves had changed from between when he sat down to write The Hobbit and when he finished writing The Lord of the Rings. Like, very significantly, it had shifted. And so when Peter Jackson then is coming to do his depiction, there is a work of cohesion that he has that is not there in the text, that he has to bring to he has to decide for the text. Yeah. And Edith, I'm with you. In many ways, I'm with you. That Edith was saying, I disagree vehemently. With the idea of bringing consistency. One of the most charming things about The Hobbit is the authorial interjections. Exactly. Which Tolkien wanted to remove. Like had Tolkien succeeded, had he finished doing his revision of The Hobbit that he began in 1960, which was pretty dreadful, it would have been fairly awful. My characterization of the first 2.5 chapters that we have of the 1960 Hobbit is it's like the published Hobbit with all the fun sucked out. Basically, is what we. It's like, take everything that made you smile in The Hobbit and remove it, and then everything that's left is what he was working with, basically. So yeah, I mean, it's but I understand Tolkien's drive to do it. Like, and I can appreciate Tolkien's drive to do it. Yeah. But he didn't do it. And Jackson set out to do it. Jackson had to do it, in a sense. I mean, that was left to Jackson to do.
And especially if he wanted to tell a story about dwarves, like, you have to be clear about your hero and the world they come in and the culture that they grew up in. Like, it doesn't matter if it's a dwarf or an elf or a human or whatever. Like, you have to know that world inside and out in order to tell their story. So he had to define it, and hopefully he used the resources that we all know, but Yeah, and in many respects he did. Again, this is where a lot of people were misunderstanding what I was saying in that video when I was talking about the published text of The Lord of the Rings. And when I said in the context of that discussion, Tolkien doesn't say that female dwarves have beards. He doesn't. In The Lord of the Rings, he doesn't say that. Whereas in the films, he does say that later on. In the world building thing that he's doing, that again is printed in the War of the Jewels that we were just discussing, he decides, oh yeah, dwarf women totally have beards. But that was his reaction to what was said in The Lord of the Rings. He doesn't say it. Whereas, by contrast, Jackson's dwarves, right? Think how Jackson makes a whole big joke about the fact that dwarf women have beards.
on multiple occasions, right? And so therefore it becomes something which is, in the mind of viewers, it is Lord of the Rings lore, right?
Yeah.
That they, and again, they're getting that from Jackson. Now, I'm not saying that Jackson was making that up out of whole cloth. He's not. There are sources for that, right? However, people don't realize they're not getting that from the text of the Lord of the Rings. They're getting it from Jackson. Yeah. I think this might be the most laudatory conversation I have had about the Hobbit films in 10 years.
It's too. I'm very proud of you. Yeah. But it's because we're not talking about, story. We're talking about dwarves.
Yeah, exactly. And again, although I do think the silliness and the those tonal problems of like trying to be serious and comic at the same time and everything just, end up, the silliness that gets overlaid over, even when we get to, to Dan riding the pig at the end, right? The Bill Connolly character.
Yeah.
Bill Connolly, by the way, I think would be my counterexample to, like, I think John Rhys Davies was perfect. And he was wonderful. Like John Rhys Davies doing John Rhys Davies things was marvelous for Gimli in a lot of ways, and especially what they were trying to do with Gimli. Bill Connolly doing Bill Connolly things as Dan, I think, was disastrously bad. And again, I'm not even saying I think Bill Connolly did a bad job. I think it was horrible casting. Anyway. So,
John Rhys Davies, they got a Shakespearean actor, and Shakespearean comedy is funny, but it's serious and it's smart and it's grounded, all that stuff. And John Rhys Davies can pull that off.
Yeah. Druid's Fire, I think that is probably true. I think that's right. Bill Connolly was a bad Dan, just as Sylvester McCoy was a bad Radagast. And I know, Druid's Fire, how much you do not intend to diss Sylvester McCoy in saying that. I think you and I both love Sylvester McCoy, and certainly love Sylvester McCoy as the Doctor. But I agree. I think that the whole approach of Radagast that was embodied in the casting of Sylvester McCoy.
Yeah, we started a fight, Corey. Take a breath, everyone.
We did.
Remember, it's just discussion, appreciation, understanding. We're all going to be okay.
And people can have different opinions. If you like, it's fine for people to like it.
To enjoy what you enjoy. Don't take away people's cookies and scones. All right.
Right.
We're going to put a pin in this. Because if you even think about opening Rings of Power, we're going to have
we're already over time. So
we'll never say it's just a movie, Phil. That's not a good argument.
that never works. Yeah, you're just going to start another fight by saying that. Yeah. Anyway, so we'll plan to follow this up next time with a discussion of the Rings of Power dwarves and see what happens. Kind of the frame that they're working within, the relationship with the Jackson films. It's funny. I mean, I know when we're talking with the Amazon Prime folks, they don't like us to have that conversation. They don't want the focus of the conversation to be on the Peter Jackson films and thinking, but it is very clear. I mean, you can't not talk about that, right? And we all know it really well, and so do they. And so do they. And it's a very present reality. Anyway, we will next time.
I will say one more thing, just in case you guys haven't seen it. There's the Corridor Crew, which I reference a lot on here. They're a YouTube group that talk about special effects. They just did a bit on speaking to one of the visual effects guys from Rings of Power. So if you haven't checked it out, that was pretty fascinating about how all the real effects that they use. So
awesome.
Go find that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Neat.
See you next week.
All right. Very good. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you guys next week. Same time. Bye now.